She was already well into his twilight years, but every Valentine's Day, without fail, she would put on her finest makeup, slip into her prettiest dress, and make her way to the very train station where she had said goodbye to her husband 65 years ago, because he had made her a promise that he would meet her there on Valentine's Day. And so she waited, for 65 long years. Caroline slowly walked up to the platform. Her eyes landed on that faded old photograph. Her fingers never quite touched it, but the memories were already crashing through her mind like a tidal wave. Back in 1944, Caroline had been radiant. Her eyes were full of dreams about the new life ahead of her as a bride. Her husband Neil was a handsome Navy pilot. In those war-torn days, every goodbye came with a knot of fear in your stomach. Watching Caroline cry, unable to stop her tears, Neil made her a vow. He would come back to her. Safely, they held each other tight, their tears and promises all tangled up in that final kiss. The train's whistle blared like a countdown from fate itself, pushing them toward the moment they dreaded most. The wheels started to turn, slowly at first. He had no choice but to step onto that train. They clung to each other, neither one willing to let go, until the picking up speed of the train pulled them further and further apart. Right as Neil stepped through the carriage door, Caroline suddenly remembered the gift still clutched in her hand. The Valentine's Day present she had made for him with her own hands. She rushed to hand it over. Neil tore it open right there at the door. It was a handmade heart-shaped charm. She ran alongside the train, desperately scanning every crowded window, until his figure finally vanished into the morning light and steam. The separation had only just begun, but the longing was already overflowing. Just as she thought that was the last she'd ever see of him, his voice rang out from the distance, strong and determined. Neil promised her then he would be back by next Valentine's Day, but that promise, along with that kiss still heavy with the weight of war, would be the last imprint he ever left on her. Neil's plane went missing over the Pacific. The military officially declared him killed in action. The station master had witnessed her pilgrimage for 25 years. Every Valentine's Day, Caroline showed up right on time, dressed in her best. But what he didn't know was that for the 40 years before he even took the job, back when Caroline was still a school teacher, she had taken the day off every single Valentine's Day, without fail to come to this same station. But this year, everything changed. Her grandson couldn't bear to watch his grandmother, clinging to a hope that would never come true, year after year. So he took her story to a TV station. An elderly woman waiting 65 years for her husband? That was exactly the kind of story that would grab the whole nation's attention. The assignment landed on reporter Susan's desk. At the time, Susan was stuck in her own emotional mess. She felt lost when it came to love. She doubted whether any promise was worth keeping. She took on the story with a professional detachment at first, because to her, this was probably just an old woman's delusion, born from grief too deep to heal. But the moment she sat down with Caroline, every assumption she had went out the window. There was no madness in Caroline's eyes, no bitterness, just a clarity and stillness that only come from a lifetime of carrying weight. Looking at the framed photos on the shelf, one of them held a picture of her and Neil when they were young, both of them beaming, like their smiles could hold the whole world's happiness right there. Susan came thinking she was covering a tragedy. She left realizing she had stumbled upon a monument to love. When Susan first asked for an interview, Caroline gently shook her head, no. But Susan persisted and showed up again, only to find Caroline's house completely empty. She immediately tracked down her grandson. It turned out Union Station wasn't her only destination. Every Saturday, she would dress up and head to a veterans nursing home, and just like she used to stand in front of a classroom, she would read stories to the soldiers who had come back from war. They had been through what Neil had been through. Listening to them was her way of staying close to love. Susan thought that doing this would only make Caroline's pain worse. At the same time, she also thought it was sweet that Lucas supported his grandmother in all of this. Lucas put it this way, we support each other. After she lost my grandfather, she spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. My father, her students, me, and those men. She was only 20 years old then. Now it's my turn to take care of her. Lucas's words broke through Susan's doubts. Over lunch, Susan finally asked the question. Softly, Caroline answered. In the beginning, she just hoped she might find Neil. But over time, she got used to the feeling of helping others, and this kind, resilient woman. After just 2 days of knowing each other, opened up to Susan on her own. The camera's red light blinked on, and Caroline looked a little nervous. But as she let herself go back, time seemed to rewind to 1943, to that war-ravaged world, where two souls who had known each other since childhood were pulled back together by fate. They had grown up together as kids. Neil was a handsome Navy pilot. Caroline worked behind the scenes in logistics. It felt so natural, the way their hearts gravitated toward each other, and once they held hands, neither ever wanted to let go. As a soldier, Neil had always felt guilty about how safe and easy his job was until he met Caroline. One night under a beautiful moon, Neil opened his heart and confessed the love he'd been carrying for her. They got engaged in 7 days. 3 days later, they were married. In a time when even tomorrow felt uncertain. The most important lesson they learned from the war was this: don't waste another second. Don't let love just slip away. They bought an old house from her uncle, their very first home together. It was run down and full of termites. But the first thing they did as a married couple was to bring it back to life with their own hands. Neil touched every single plank of wood, drove in every nail. They brought back the chair Caroline had been sitting on when he proposed. They dreamed of kids running all over the yard someday, and Neil even joked that he'd build a white picket fencedo, keep all those kids corralled inside. A few weeks later, the little home was good as new. One golden afternoon, bathed in sunlight, classical music drifted lazily from the radio, and the garden hose cast a rainbow through the mist. Right there in that spray of water and halo of light, they chased each other around like two carefree kids, twirling and dancing without a care. In that moment, it was just the two of them, but that happiness didn't last. Neil got his orders. He was being deployed. The house suddenly felt empty, with only Caroline and the new life quietly growing inside her. But distance couldn't dilute their love. They poured their longing into letters, sending pages across the ocean, each one carrying the warmth of the other's touch. Neil even carved a tiny wooden airplane with his own hands for the child he hadn't yet met. It was the first and last shape his fatherhood would ever take. Days turned into months. Sometimes visitors came bearing news that darkened the whole room. Caroline watched her neighbor fall apart after receiving a telegram, but life had to go on. The day their child was born, Caroline rushed to take a picture and mailed it straight to her husband far away. She thought the baby would bring new hope into their lives, but that hope turned out to be heartbreakingly brief. One day, Caroline heard on the radio that a massive offensive had been launched. She told her son in his crib that Daddy was up there in his plane, thinking about them, and that he'd be home soon. And then she saw him. That familiar mailman pedaled past her house, then stopped his bike right outside the fence. Caroline's eyes welled up as she watched him walk toward her, with a grim look on his face. The telegram read, Caroline's husband, Neil Thomas, was missing in action. Missing, not dead. Caroline burst into tears, clinging to that one word like it was a lifeline. She told herself Neil wasn't gone. It was her way of comforting herself, and her declaration to the future. That declaration became 65 years of silent devotion. At that point in the retelling, the weight of grief became too much for the elderly woman to bear. She stood up to go rest in her room, but on the stairs, overcome with emotions, she fell. Susan and the crew rushed her to the hospital, filled with guilt, but Lucas comforted her. If talking about all of this stirred up his grandmother's feelings, then at least for the last few days, she had been the happiest version of herself, like that young girl in love again, watching Lucas care for his grandmother so tenderly. Susan felt a pang of envy. She said softly she hoped that when she turned 80, she would have someone like that by her side. She asked Lucas how he did it. Lucas said his grandmother was so much stronger than anyone gave her credit for. Then he said plainly, she was just a girl when my grandfather went missing. There was never anyone else after him. Just one love in a lifetime. How many people get to have something like that? Even though she only loved once, she never stopped loving. Over the course of the interview, Susan came to realize that Caroline's love hadn't withered in her husband's absence. On the contrary, it had grown richer and deeper through all those years of waiting. The ice around Susan's heart started to crack. She no longer wanted to be just a reporter. She wanted to help Caroline find out what really happened to Neil and give this decades-long wait the closure it deserved. But then the station director heard Caroline had been hospitalized, and he pulled the plug on the story. He was afraid that running the piece would make the old woman sick again, and that her family would cause problems for the station. To make Susan drop the whole thing, he gave her a new assignment: fly to Washington to interview a senator. That trip, which seemed completely unrelated, would turn out to be the key that unlocked the mystery. During the conversation, Susan couldn't help but bring up Caroline's story. She never expected that this love seed, buried for 65 years, would take root in the heart of this powerful senator. Not long after, the senator called Susan. With the help of military archives, they found a crucial lead. One of Neil's comrades had survived the war. Susan immediately changed her flight and flew to Texas, where she met that soldier's son. This man had grown up hearing his father's war stories. He recalled that his father always said Neil had saved his life. It happened on Bataan Island in the Philippines. Their plane had been shot down by the enemy, and Neil, at the brink of death himself, gave up his only chance to survive. He gave it to his father. His father's wartime diary was yellowed with age. Tucked carefully inside its pages was a letter, one Neil had entrusted to him to deliver, a letter for Caroline, one that had been delayed for 65 years. On the day Caroline got out of the hospital, Susan rushed over with that heavy, precious letter in hand, ready to give her the surprise of a lifetime. Caroline unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Her eyes blurred with tears as she read Neil's handwriting. She finally knew the truth. Her Neil could have come home alive, but he had given up his life to save his comrade. The diary pointed to another lead, a key witness still living on Bataan Island in the Philippines. A man named Morang. Susan spent days making calls and finally connected Caroline with this living piece of history. When Morang met the widow of his old friend Neil, he was just as moved. He remembered the first time he met Neil. Neil was badly wounded, but he paid no attention to his own injuries. He pointed to Billings, who was even worse off. And with the last of his strength, he said, "Save him first." After Neil recovered, he grew stronger and joined a local resistance group. He always carried a photo of Caroline and their son close to his chest, along with that heart-shaped charm, her faith, her love, carried with him everywhere. During one mission, they were planning to ambush a patrol, but Neil threw himself in front of a young child to protect him and took a bullet in the back. He died in that foreign jungle. The locals buried him on a cliff overlooking the sea, so that his spirit could always find its way home. At that, Caroline broke down completely. The fog of 65 years had finally lifted. Her husband hadn't just vanished. He had died a hero on the battlefield. One day, 2 Navy officers knocked on Caroline's door. The familiar uniform sent her right back to that heartbreaking day 65 years ago. But this time, they didn't come with bad news. In the 65th year since Neil Thomas had gone missing, his remains had been found, and they were coming home. They solemnly handed over Neil's personal effects to Caroline and officially told her, because Neil had shown extraordinary courage beyond the call of duty in the face of the enemy, he would be posthumously awarded the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, and the Navy Cross. After the officers left, she gently opened that worn leather wallet. Inside were photos of her and her son, and the Valentine's Day gift she had made for her husband with her own hands all those years ago. Time had never taken his love away from her. Another Valentine's Day rolled around. Going to Union Station had become a sacred ritual in Caroline's life. She sat down on that familiar wooden bench, her fingers running softly over the surface, her legs swinging gently beneath her, like that hopeful young girl she used to be. What she didn't know was that this time, the whole city wanted to give her the ending she deserved. Her story, shared by Susan and championed by the senator, had moved countless people. 65 years after Neil's death, his casket was finally brought home to the land he had loved. Caroline had waited through 66 Valentine's days, from a young woman with flowing dark hair to a white-haired elder. On this day of promises, at the far end of the platform, under the gaze of an honor guard and a crowd of onlookers, her hero finally came home. From a girl in bloom to a woman of 80, Caroline spent a lifetime keeping one appointment. From the flames of war to the peace of home, Neil had traveled through time, and at last he had come home. The Lost Valentine. It's so much more than just a story about waiting. It's a parable about faith. In an age when everything is speeding up and relationships feel more fragile than ever, Caroline's 65 years of devotion show us another way love can be. It can be this slow, this enduring. True romance isn't always roses and candlelight. Sometimes it's standing your ground through the long, lonely years, holding on even when there's hardly any hope left, just because you believe. Caroline's figure at that stage shone us a living monument, reminding everyone who sees it. Love is the one thing that can hold its own against time itself. It may not bring a loved one back to life, but it can give life a meaning that reaches far beyond death. After watching this film, let's all take another look at the love and promises around us. Because in this world, some Valentine's days might get lost, but some love never does.